Throughout history, there have been many men who became dictators and ruthlessly put their population to the sword. Men such as Chairman Mao carried out huge purges of their own people, as did Joseph Stalin, and they caused a huge amount of terror too. When dictators died, there was a distinct power vacuum, and people fought to become the successor, even at times when the former dictator had not been buried. But some of these dictators have had their coffins and graves broken into and opened in the years following their deaths, and with this many people saw the decaying corpses of their former leaders. But why were these men and sometimes their wives viewed in this way? Was it for science investigations, or were they exhumed for other more darker reasons? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Nicolae Ceausescu rose throughout the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party, and he served as the head of state from 1965 to 1989. He was someone who is classed today as a dictator, and he was married to his ruthless and power-hungry wife, Elena. Together, the pair tried to craft an image as the mother and father of the nation, but after he came into power, Ceausescu initially became very popular. He tried to restrict the influence of the Soviet Union upon his land, but his government became rather totalitarian, and he would be leading one of the most repressive regimes in Europe. He employed a secret police force to round up and spy upon those who were suspected of dissenting against him, and he also controlled the media and the press. His wife Elena even ensured that she would never be captured inside profile in photographs, as she was concerned about her large nose. Elena was a very vain woman, and Nicolae claimed that when he first met her, he never looked at another woman in a romantic way. There was further repression inside of Romania, and also human rights abuses documented. He also introduced a number of terrible policies that led to many people suffering. Nicolae tried to implement ideas that would lead to a growth in the population, but many women suffered, and there was an increase in children being made orphans. He trashed the Romanian economy too, and his nation became incredibly in debt, and in 1982 he directed the government to export most of the agriculture production, and this led to many people starving, and they couldn't get basic resources, medicine or food. It was a sorry state of affairs, but eventually, like in most nations, the people could only take so much, and an uprising occurred. The Christmas Revolution, as it was known, emerged in Romania in the December of 1989. To begin with, the protests began because of the deportation of an influential preacher, but as the days continued, the original cause of the outrage and uprising was lost, and the people began to call for an end to the Ceausescu's tyranny. They had grown tired of the man and woman at the top of their government. Inside different towns and cities, revolution broke out, and Nicolae Ceausescu left his wife Elena to deal with this, as he went off on a state visit to Iran, but Elena in principle could do very little. Eventually the army and military were ordered to fire on unarmed civilians, and there was a number of deaths. Upon her husband's return, a huge rally was organised in a square in Bucharest, and Nicolae Ceausescu, alongside Elena, lectured the crowd, and he performed a bizarre and disjointed speech. He did not have command over the crowd, and there were gunshots or fireworks heard, and there was then a general panic, but further fighting broke out between the protesters and Ceausescu's army. But at this point, some soldiers and members of the militia were beginning to actually switch in their support from the dictator and his wife to the rebels. They began to refuse to fire at civilians, and they took on the side of the people. At 12:06 on the 22nd of December 1989, the Ceausescus tried to flee the Central Committee building, where they had been holed up. A helicopter arrived to get them out, but they just managed to take off before rebels would storm onto the rooftop. The Ceausescus were feeling like cornered rats, and they could not find somewhere safe to land. Eventually their helicopter was brought down in a town in Targosvite, but it was not long before they were captured by local insurgents and police, and they were then taken to a military barracks where they were taken to trial. This trial occurred on Christmas Day, 1989, and it was clear that the legal proceedings had already been determined. It was obvious that the Ceausescus would be condemned to death, and there was no chance for them to defend themselves. Neither was there any legal counsel given to them. Elena Ceausescu was furious, and she went down kicking and screaming, and she refused to acknowledge the legality of the courtroom, and she thought she was being murdered a martyr. Following the guilty verdict and death sentence being passed, Elena and her husband were then taken out of the courtroom, and they were told to stand by the side of the wall of the military barracks. Nikolai began to sing and whistle in his final moments, but Elena was much more desperate. She screamed at the soldiers, calling them sons of dogs, and she would not settle. She had her arms secured to prevent further struggle, but in quick and efficient fashion, Elena was then faced with her firing squad, a collection of paratroop soldiers. There had been dozens who had been volunteered to shoot the dictator and his wife, but the paratroopers opened up their machine guns incredibly quickly. They shot before the instruction to fire had been given, and the television cameras, which had been set up to capture the grim spectacle, missed half of the gunshots because of how quickly they were shot. After this, their bodies were then packed away inside of a coffin and were taken to the Ghencea cemetery in Bucharest. They were buried with a simple grave, but on different sides of a path that ran through the cemetery in separate plots. They were not to begin with buried in the same grave, but it was no secret where the Ceausescus were buried. Communist symbols and many flowers decorated the graves regularly, but as the decades passed, the daughter of Elena and Nikolai asked for the remains to be dug up. She wanted her mother and her father to be buried together in the same plot. It was in the year 2010 that the graves of Nikolai Ceausescu and his wife were opened and disturbed. The reason this occurred and took place was to ensure that the bodies buried inside of these graves actually belonged to the dictator and his wife, as there was some seeds of doubt that had sprung over the years. For this to be confirmed, DNA testing was ordered. The graves were opened and the coffins of the Ceausescus were all opened. Many people witnessed the exhumations from within the cemetery. Pathologist specialists exhumed the bodies inside of the Ceausescu graves, and they lifted the corpses. For Elena Ceausescu, there was actually very little left of her, to the point that no DNA could be collected from her remains. Nikolai Ceausescu's remains were in a better state, and it was said that his body was still wearing the black winter coat and the grey fur hat that he was pictured wearing during his execution decades before. He had been buried in these, and DNA was extracted from Ceausescu's body, and it was later sent back to the laboratories for testing. Later it was confirmed that the remains inside of Nikolai Ceausescu's grave were in fact his, as a DNA match was confirmed with the Ceausescu's son. With this it's confirmed that the remains inside of the grave were in fact the former dictators, and the doubt was gotten rid of. The bones of Elena were not tested, as not enough DNA was able to be extracted, but with the proximity of the burial to her husband, and with the fact the grave was marked, it was accepted that these remains were in fact Elena's. It isn't known why the bones of the dictator decayed much slower than his wife's. Probably her coffin may have not been sealed as well as her husband's. The burial of the Ceausescus was known to have been rather quick and rapid, and they were thrown inside of graves with no embalming, and little protection to the bodies was given. The DNA of Nikolai Ceausescu was actually confirmed twice, with his brother also giving a sample to confirm it. The bodies of Nikolai and Elena Ceausescu were then buried inside of the same cemetery, in the same grave, and today there are many people who flock to the grave to pay their respects. Their bodies are marked by a tombstone, a small distance from where they were originally laid to rest. The executions of the Ceausescus was ruthless and were brutal, but for many inside of Romania, it started the beginning of a new way of life. The body of Nikolai Ceausescu was in a good state when his coffin was opened. Robespierre rose to the position of the President of the National Convention, but his short period in control was terrifying. He was known for his position as a member of the Committee of Public Safety, and he believed that following the overthrow of the monarchy, that terror was essential to stomp out any form of pro-monarchist sentiment. He wanted to make sure that no one questioned the revolution and his ideas, and because of this, thousands of people were executed. Even the wives of executed men were dragged to the guillotine after the tears they shed for their beloved, who had lost his head minutes before, were considered anti-revolutionary. It was a very dangerous time inside of France, and the terror ramped up under Robespierre's oversight, and he was acting like a perverse and sadistic dictator. He ordered the National Convention to bring in a huge change to religion in France, and to instigate a new religion known as the Cult of the Supreme Being. However, due to the horror inside of France, Robespierre was universally disliked, and he would become a figure of hatred. He was eventually arrested, and within a day, the injured Robespierre was put to death, and he was executed. He had been conspired against by rebels to bring him down, and he was brought to his execution on the 28th of July 1794 inside of Paris. One person who witnessed his execution stated that at 4 p.m, the sinister procession moved out of the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such a size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people. Spectators, men and women of all ages, filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was a universal jubilation, coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with double force. Everyone applauded wildly and seemed to be sorry they could not do more. Most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, Caution, and Henrot were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigands the gendarmes had surprised in the forest and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty, blood-stained linen. His features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it even more repulsive. He kept his eyes downwards and almost closed. Whether that was from the pain of his wounds or an awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. Just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster spewed from hell! The thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked sadly as she said, "Go now, evildoer, go down into your grave, carrying the curses of the wives and mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him out prone until it was his turn for execution. While his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared to not be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried up the scaffold. Some said that when he saw the instrument of death, he heaved a sigh of pain. But before dying, he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, the executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which the surgeon had put on his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at last it was severed from his body, and the executioner held it by the hair to show to the people, it presented an indescribable, horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal that nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the Commune or their outlawed accomplices. His head had been taken clean off, and with this, Madame Tussaud was ordered to create a death mask of Robespierre, and she took a cast of his head after it had been taken off. She moulded this at the foot of the guillotine, and then created a wax head of the tyrant from this. Tussaud had also done this with the French Queen Marie Antoinette, but the people were incredibly angry after Robespierre's execution, and there was a fear that his body would be ripped to pieces. Because of this, there were conditions put in place to stop the public accessing his corpse, and his remains were taken to the Arancis cemetery in Paris. And they were not buried in an individual grave, but his head and body were placed inside of a mass grave. Many people who were buried in this cemetery were those who had lost their heads on the guillotine during Robespierre's terror, but the architect of the bloodshed would also be buried here. As the revolution continued, the cemetery where Robespierre was buried became very full, and with this further burial grounds were searched for. But many of the bodies within the cemetery were in a bad way, and their identities could not be worked out when they were exhumed. The restored king, King Louis XVII, even looked for his sister, but he could not find her body. Inside of the Arancis cemetery, Robespierre was exhumed during the clean-up of the graveyards, and along with hundreds of other people's corpses, his bones and remains were dug up, and they were then taken to the catacombs of Paris. Underground, these ossuaries would hold the remains of around 6 million people, and lots of these were those who had been guillotined during the French Revolution. Robespierre's remains are inside of the catacombs somewhere, but his remains have yet to have been located, and it would be practically impossible to find them due to the sheer amount of bones in the catacombs. But discovered inside of the walls of a chapel in Paris are a set of remains that some have claimed belonged to Robespierre, and some of these makeshift coffins are covered in leather, and it's believed that these contain the bones of important people. Robespierre was one of the most ruthless leaders in European history, and his popularity quickly went downhill as he would order the guillotined executions of thousands of people. He was someone who was involved in a shootout before he too was arrested and executed. But still, the remains of Robespierre today are probably missing under the feet of many inside of Paris who pass over the catacombs every day. Now, Ivan IV was born on the 25th of August 1530 in a small village near Moscow, the son of Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow. His early life was marked by tragedy and political intrigue, and Vasily III died in 1533 when Ivan was just 3 years old, leaving the state in the hands of his mother as regent. Elena's rule, however, was cut short when she died suddenly in 1538, possibly poisoned by a boyar, a noble, factions who sought to control the young heir, and after her death, Ivan and his younger brother Yuri were effectively orphans, subjected to neglect and mistreatment at the hands of the boyar families who vied for influence. Ivan would later recall in his letters that as a child he witnessed the boyars fighting and killing each other, while he and his brother were left hungry, dirty and humiliated. These early experiences fostered in Ivan a deep distrust and hatred of the boyar aristocracy, a resentment that would later define his rule. At the age of 16, in 1547, Ivan was crowned with the title the Tsar of all Rus, in a ceremony that emphasised his divine right to rule. This was a pivotal moment in Russian history, as the title of Tsar, derived from Caesar, suggested imperial ambitions and spiritual authority akin to that of the Byzantine emperors. The early years of Ivan's reign were surprisingly progressive and marked by a desire to reform and strengthen the Russian state, guided by capable advisors, particularly a group known as the Chosen Council. Ivan enacted a series of reforms designed to modernise and centralise power. In 1549, he convened the Zemsky Soba, Russia's first national assembly, bringing together representatives of various social classes to discuss governance. He introduced a new legal code, the Sudmink of 1550, which was aimed to standardise justice and curb the arbitrary power of the boyars. Ivan also reorganised the military, creating the Stelsky, a corps of professional musketeers, and expanded the system of local self-government. One of his most enduring accomplishments was the conquest and expansion of Russian territory. In 1552, Ivan launched a successful campaign against the Khanty of Kazan, a Tatar state that had long threatened Russia's eastern borders. The victory was celebrated with the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, a masterpiece of Russian architecture. In 1556, he captured the Kazanti of Askatan, gaining control of the lower Vogel River and opening trade routes to the Caspian Sea. These victories cemented Ivan's reputation as a formidable ruler and expanded Russia into the multi-ethnic empire. However, Ivan's fortunes began to decline during the protracted Livian War from 1558 to 1583. His goal was to gain access to the Baltic Sea by seizing territories from the weakened Livonian order, but the war dragged on for decades. It involved Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark. The conflict drained the Russian economy, devastated much of the countryside, and resulted in eventual defeat. Russia not only failed to secure the Baltic, but then also lost valuable western territories. It was during this period that Ivan's chapter began to darken. In 1560, the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanova, deeply affected him. Ivan suspected that she had been poisoned by boyars, further fueling his paranoia and hatred of the nobility. This personal tragedy marked the beginning of his transformation from a reformist ruler into a tyrant. In 1565, Ivan introduced the infamous Optionchina, a policy that divided Russia into two parts. The Optionching, directly controlled by Ivan, and the Zemshing, administered by traditional boyar institutions. Ivan created a personal guard, the Oprinsky, who dressed in black, carried dog heads and brooms as symbols of ferocity and purification, and were tasked with rooting out treason and opposition. The Oprinching unleashed a new reign of terror. Whole towns were destroyed, thousands were tortured and exiled or executed, and the boyar class was decimated. One of the most notorious episodes was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570, when Ivan suspected the city of treason and ordered the Oprinchki to carry out mass killings, looting and torture, resulting in thousands of deaths. While the Oprinching temporarily strengthened Ivan's autocratic control, it also severely weakened Russia's economy and military. Trade declined, agricultural land was devastated, and the general population suffered enormously from famine and oppression. Ivan's later years were marked by instability and personal tragedy. His temper and paranoia extended to his own family. In 1581, during a violent argument, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, with his staff, fatally wounding him. This event not only devastated Ivan personally, but also left Russia without a strong successor, as his surviving son, Fyodor, was mentally weak and ill-prepared to rule. And by the early 1580s, Ivan was physically and mentally deteriorating. His health declined and his erratic behaviour became more pronounced. Despite his violent tendencies, Ivan was a deeply religious man, spending hours in prayer and confessing his sins even as he continued to commit atrocities. On the 28th of March 1584, whilst he was playing chess, Ivan the Terrible had a stroke and he died relatively instantly. He was buried inside of a Moscow cathedral and was later laid to rest inside of a large stone tomb which carries many inscriptions. But in 1963, almost 400 years after his death, the tomb of Ivan and his sons was opened for the first time, and the graves were disturbed. And what was found inside the tomb was the heavily decomposed remains of Ivan, and there was no skin that existed on the remains, only bones. His teeth were relatively in good condition, and there was also a lot of debris and dirt inside of the tomb covering the remains. This could have been the remains of clothes that he was buried in. The body was analysed and used. This was discovered that despite suggestions at the time that Ivan suffered from syphilis, this wasn't the case, and it was also discovered that he was not poisoned using arsenic and that he had not been strangled to death. The analysis also showed that when he died he was around 5'10" tall and he weighed around 90 kilograms. It was also found that he had a lot of bone spurs or lumps which formed around his joints, meaning he had arthritis and suffered with his joints. These were said to have been uncharacteristic with his age, meaning that his lifestyle may have caused him to have joint issues. He may have been heavier too, and it was concluded that Ivan the Terrible may have struggled to move in his final years, but he also had an excessive concentration of mercury in his remains. This could have been part of a treatment or ointment which was applied to his joints to try and help heal them. Now, Ivan IV, the Terrible, remains one of the most fascinating figures in history, a ruler of extraordinary intelligence, ambition, and willpower, yet also plagued by paranoia, brutality, and personal demons. His life story is a study in contrasts, a child neglected by the nobility, who grew to distrust and destroy them, a ruler who began as a reformer but became a despot, a man who sought to unite and expand Russia but also left it fractured and weakened. Ultimately, Ivan's reign laid both the foundations for the empire and the seeds of the future turmoil. His legacy is a testament to the dangers of unchecked power and the enduring complexities of leadership in a land as vast and turbulent as Russia. In the final days of the Second World War in Europe, there were many brutal and harrowing scenes, but one which was burned on the memory of many was the display of Benito Mussolini's corpse inside of Milan Square. The former fascist dictator of Italy had been executed by gunshot by the roadside close to Lake Como, and then his body was hoisted up in front of thousands of angry Italian people. Mussolini had plunged Italy into the Second World War as he allied himself with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and many Italians began to question their war effort, and eventually the dictator fell from power as he was ousted from power. However, his friend Hitler rescued him before he was then captured again, and the partisans then swiftly sentenced him to death. However, Mussolini's remains, following their post-mortem, were then buried, but the coffin was broken into, and his remains were stolen, and were then concealed and hidden for some time. As the end of the Second World War emerged in Europe, Mussolini was trying to search for a way out of Italy, and he tried to save his skin by looking to head towards Switzerland. He was with his mistress, Clara Petacci, and they could not cross the border. However, on the 27th of April 1945, they joined a German Air Force convoy which was going towards Germany. Presumably, Mussolini may have believed that Hitler would save him and offer him some sort of protection, and possibly a one-way trip away from the danger of his enemies. But the convoy was attacked by partisans who were hunting fascists, and with this the Germans then gave over a number of fascist stowaways. However, near to the town of Dongo, Mussolini was found hiding under the cover, and one man who found him claimed that his face was like wax and his stare glassy, but somehow blind. I read utter exhaustion, but not fear. Mussolini seemed completely lacking in will, spiritually dead. He was now in the hands of his enemies, and Mussolini was sentenced to death as the partisans wanted to execute every high-profile fascist politician to get rid of them. Radio Milano announced the capture of the former dictator, and they said, "The head of this association of delinquents, Mussolini, while yellow with rancour and fear and trying to cross the Swiss frontier, has been arrested. He must be handed over to a tribunal of the people so it can judge him quickly. We want this, even though we think an execution platoon is too much of an honour for this man. He would deserve to be killed like a mangy dog." The executioner was a man named Walter Aldizio, who took possession of Mussolini and his mistress Petacci, and they were then transported to the Villa Belmont near to Lake Como, and they were then ordered out of the truck. Aldizio ruthlessly shot this machine gun into the pair, littering their bodies with bullets from his weapon, and after this Mussolini's remains, along with his mistresses, were taken into the centre of Milan, where they were to be hanged upside down in disgrace. Before this, the remains were spat at and beaten to the point where they were heavily disfigured and bloodied, and they were hardly recognisable, as Mussolini was the subject of much of this action. The crowd were angry, and then when the Americans arrived, they ordered Mussolini's body to be cut down, and they then performed an autopsy on his body, and his brain was allegedly removed. It was found that 7 to 9 bullets slaughtered and killed Mussolini, and 4 of these were near to his heart and were fatal. However, one of the biggest issues with Mussolini's death and posthumous treatment was that Adolf Hitler made his mind up that his body would not fall into the hands of his enemies, and it was said relating to Mussolini's death that if he did learn of the full glory tale, it could have done no more than confirm his anxiety to take his own life before it was too late, and to prevent his body from being seized by his enemies. But there was a fear that fascists wanted the remains of Mussolini, as they believed he was a martyr, and his body was then placed in a coffin, and this was then secured and nailed shut, and his body was then taken to Muscoco Cemetery in the north of Milan. And he was then interred inside of a grave with no headstone. His coffin was a simple and cheap pine one, and it was covered inside with blood shavings to ensure that blood did not seep out of the coffin. Mussolini was not dressed in a shirt, and he was left as he was found, heavily battered, and his face was very swollen. But his burial was no secret, and it was not long before his body was dug up and his grave was disturbed. There was still a significant fascist amount of support inside of Italy at the time, and many venerated the former dictator almost as a god. His body was hunted to become a relic, and on the anniversary of the Italian liberation of the Nazi forces, a right-wing journalist and his 2 friends decided to steal Mussolini's body. Domenico Lesicchi was the man who led the grave-robbing attempt, and they managed to make off with his body. They went into the cemetery and under the cover of nightfall broke the ground with their spades, and Mussolini had been buried for a matter of months. But then they lifted the coffin out of the ground, and they placed it on the back of a truck, and it was then taken away. A note was left in the grave saying, "Finally, O Juice, you are with us. We will cover you with roses, but the smell of your virtue will overpower those roses." However, it was no great secret that Mussolini's body had been stolen, and the Italian authorities then began to hunt those who had taken it. But one prominent fascist element of support for Mussolini in Italy was inside of the church, and there were some priests who still supported his cause. Domenico Lexessi then smuggled Mussolini's body inside of a church, and they then took it to different places and moved it around, and monks helped in this, and they stored it in different areas, including a villa, before it was then taken to a monastery outside of Milan, known as the Certosa di Pavia. But the authorities learned of this, and when they discovered Mussolini's body in the monastery, they did not find all of him. someone had opened the coffin and had smuggled away one of his legs, meaning they had cut this from his body, and this is still missing to this day. And it presumably still exists and is considered a relic for fascists. But there were 2 friars who were arrested for the crime, and they were also charged with hiding a body, but there was a new problem. The authorities now considered what to do with his body, and they then held it within police stations for some time, before the coffin was then taken to the Capuchin monastery in the town of Carri-Maggiore. It stayed here for 11 long years, simply locked inside of a cupboard, and this location was kept very secret and quiet. But Mussolini's family at the time then appealed to the police for his body, and they wanted it to be returned to the family crypt, and this was then accepted years later. On the 1st of September 1957, over 12 years since his death, the coffin of Mussolini and the remains of him were then taken back to the Mussolini family crypt, and they were then deposited inside of a large tomb. Today this is a tourist attraction, and many people visit the tomb of the man who sent Italy into the Second World War, and the man who allied his nation very closely with Adolf Hitler. But one thing to consider is what happened to his leg, as this is still missing, meaning that Mussolini's complete remains are not inside of the tomb. By the mid-1650s, Oliver Cromwell was at the height of his power. After leading Parliament's forces to victory in the English Civil War and playing a central role in the execution of King Charles I in 1649, Cromwell became the most powerful man in England. In the December of 1653, he was installed as Lord Protector under a new written constitution called the Instrument of Government. While he rejected the crown when it was later offered to him, his role was in many ways that of a king in all but name. He lived in the royal palaces, he held court, he wielded supreme authority over the army and government, and Cromwell was a deeply religious man, convinced that God had chosen him to guide England. Yet ruling the country proved exhausting. His years as Lord Protector were filled with political struggles, plots and uprisings. Maintaining control required constant balancing between strict Puritan rule, military oversight, and the demand for some form of parliamentary government. By the mid-1650s, the burdens of office and personal grief began to take a toll on his health. Cromwell's personal life in these years was marked by sorrow. In 1656, his beloved daughter Elizabeth Claypole became gravely ill. She was one of his closest companions, and Cromwell often sought her advice. Her death in the August of 1658 devastated him. Accounts suggest that her suffering and eventual passing left him broken-hearted and physically weakened. Contemporaries recorded that Cromwell was never the same afterwards. Some even suggested that his own health collapsed under the weight of grief, and only weeks after his daughter's death, Cromwell himself became seriously unwell. In the late August of 1658, he developed what was described as a tetane ague, an old term often used for malaria-like fevers that returned in cycles. He suffered from shivering fits, sweats, exhaustion, and doctors at the time attempted to treat him with purges, bloodletting, and herbal remedies, but these only weakened him further. His illness was complicated by other health problems. Cromwell was known to suffer from kidney stones, and some sources suggest he may have also been affected by a urinary infection or septicemia. Rumours quickly spread, and some claimed he had been poisoned, whilst others insisted his death was the judgment of God for executing the king. By the end of August, it was clear the Lord Protector was gravely ill. His physicians and ministers gathered at Whitehall Palace where he lay in bed. Eyewitnesses recorded that Cromwell turned to prayer and spoke of his faith. On the 2nd of September 1658, his condition worsened dramatically. His fever grew more violent and he was often delirious. He is said to have murmured prayers and Bible verses, convinced that he would soon meet his Creator. The following day, the 3rd of September 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. The date was striking. It was the anniversary of two of his greatest victories as a general, the Battle of Dunbar in 1650 and the Battle of Worcester in 1651. To Cromwell and his followers, these victories had always seemed like signs of God's favour. That he died on the same date may have seemed like divine providence. He was 59 years old. Cromwell's death left England in uncertainty. His eldest surviving son, Richard Cromwell, was named as his successor, but Richard lacked his father's authority, military experience and charisma. Though he was proclaimed Lord Protector, he struggled to maintain power. The army, which had been the true source of Oliver Cromwell's strength, soon grew restless and turned against Richard. Within less than a year, Richard was forced to resign and the country slipped into political chaos. By 1660, the monarchy was restored under King Charles II, son of the executed Charles I. The very system that Oliver Cromwell had built crumbled within 2 years of his death. Initially, Cromwell was honoured with one of the most elaborate funerals in English history. His body lay in state at Somerset House, where visitors could file past to pay respects. The ceremony echoed that of kings, complete with heralds, banners and processions, and on the 23rd of November 1658 his coffin was carried in great splendour to Westminster Abbey. He was buried in a wall vault near the tomb of Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Well, the body of Cromwell was actually buried days before the funeral, because it was rotting significantly and needed dealing with straight away. But the symbolism was clear. Oliver Cromwell was being placed alongside kings, as if to mark him as their equal. For a time it seemed as though the Cromwell family might establish a dynasty of their own, but events soon changed. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, his supporters sought vengeance for the execution of his father. Parliament ordered the bodies of the regicides, those who had signed Charles I's death warrant, to be exhumed and punished. Cromwell, though dead for 2 years, was singled out for special treatment. On the 30th of January 1661, the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, the bodies of Cromwell, Henry Ireton, his son-in-law, and John Bradshaw, the judge who presided over Charles I's trial, were dug up from Westminster Abbey. Cromwell's corpse and head, still attached, were hidden in the wall of the middle aisle of Henry VII's Lady Chapel, and the workers broke open where it had been buried, but it took a long time to exhume and remove it. There was a significant amount of wood and cloth, and this had made the coffin difficult to get out of the abbey. The corpses were taken to Tyburn, the site of public executions in London. There they were subjected to a macabre, posthumous execution. The bodies were shrouded originally, but then this was removed, and their open coffins were dragged through the streets with thousands of onlookers viewing the rotting corpses before they arrived at the gallows in Tyburn. The bodies were hanged from the gallows all day, before then being cut down and decapitated. Their heads were placed on spikes above Westminster Hall as a warning to others, and Cromwell's head remained on display for more than 20 years before it eventually fell off the spike. Throughout the next few centuries, it passed through many people's hands, and it even became an exhibition inside of a circus-style attraction. The head, it was said, by the 19th century still had hair, flesh and a beard on it, and it had the post driven through it of which it had been placed above Westminster Hall. The authenticity of the head was later confirmed, and the head today is buried inside of Sydney Sussex College, in a secret location inside of an oak box which is airtight. So this is the coffin of Cromwell's head. But what about the rest of his body? Now it is believed that following the posthumous execution, his body may have been taken from the pit in Tyburn by his daughter, and that she then had this placed inside of her husband's home at Newbury Priory. There is a sealed stone vault within this priory that does claim to contain the headless remains of Cromwell, and still today the family rejects requests, even those from royalty, that the tomb will not be opened for examination. There is speculation the body remained inside of Tyburn, and the pit where it was then dumped inside of a mass grave, but until the vault is opened we may never really know. So, the coffin of Oliver Cromwell was originally opened with what is a unique intention in mind, to exhume him so that his rotting remains could be executed and subjected to a rough and brutal public execution. This signalled the strength of the new king, Charles II, the son of the king who Cromwell helped to put to death. If the burial vault is ever opened inside of Newbury Priory, it would answer a lot more questions as to where the mortal remains of Cromwell truly are. But it is possible that he is a man who has two coffins, one containing his head inside of Cambridge, and the other could be in a quiet vault where very few people go to visit. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.